Are we fine with me starting, or how, are you going to start? Or
I'll just wait until 1 o'clock, Lauren.
No, that's fine. I just wanted to make sure suddenly we're not all just staring at the screen.
And then I'll introduce you and introduce the society.
Okay. That's all good. That's all good. Estelle, was that your groceries? That's so funny.
It was something else, Lauren.
Okay.
So give it 1 more minute, just as people are logging on. We're up to 74 participants so far, looking good.
Wow.
You're very popular.
It's the Boleyns. I don't think we can take credit for it.
I would have, Lauren, thank you.
Oh, well, maybe it's us. Okay.
So T-minus 30.
Okay.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's 1 o'clock by my watch up here in North Yorkshire, so let's make a start. My name is John Cooper, and I'm director of the Society of Antiquaries of London. That sounds like it's the top job. Fortunately, it isn't, but it does mean that I have a particular responsibility for events like today's, which is very exciting for me because I'm a Tudor historian. Now, in normal circumstances, Lauren and Estelle would be speaking to us in Burlington House, just off Piccadilly, where the Society's fine collection of Tudor portraits, including Henry VIII, would be gazing down upon us. In fact, there are so many of you here today that even in normal times, we wouldn't have been able to fit you all into our meeting room, and you're all very welcome. Now, in case you're unfamiliar with the Society of Antiquaries, then we are the senior scholarly society devoted to the study and the understanding of the material remains of the past. Now, material means objects and buildings and artifacts, but it can also mean books and manuscripts and portraits and other kinds of paintings. And we're going to be thinking about some of those as sources today. We are a fellowship of 3,000 across the world. We're a registered charity, and we put on quite a lot of public events as well as academic conferences, publishing monographs, and a journal, the Antiquaries Journal, and the Salon online briefing as well. We also currently have an online exhibition that's relevant to today's lecture, which, if you're inspired by hearing more about the Boleyns, then you can go and hear and find out more about the man who made and broke them, Henry VIII, in our online exhibition, Henry VIII, Defender of the Faith, with that very important question mark at the end of it, raising some doubt about the extent to which Henry VIII was Defender of the Faith. And you'll find a link to that on the Society's website. Well, it's my great pleasure to introduce this quite unusual public talk for us on the Boleyns behind the scenes of a scandalous family. This is a little bit of an experiment for us. We are very familiar with putting on public lectures. We haven't had a recent opportunity to have genuine academic historians reflecting on the presentation of history on television and the research processes that underpin that. It's something that I've done a little bit of in the past and have always enjoyed. It's something that academic historians sometimes find it's a slightly controversial thing to be doing. I think we'll be hearing today from Lauren and Estelle why the academic processes underpinning good historical television can be rigorous and searching, and indeed that's one of the things that they're going to be thinking about. I suspect that their talk is going to promote lots of questions. We handle questions by the chat function on Zoom, which you can start firing through towards the end of the lecture, and then I'll pose those on your behalf to our speakers. So, to introduce our two speakers, Dr. Lauren Mackay is an early modern historian, author, and lecturer. Her first book, Inside the Tudor Court, Henry VIII and his Six Wives Through the Eyes of the Spanish Ambassador, is the first and the only biographer of the Imperial Ambassador. I really hope I'm going to pronounce this right. Eustache Chapuis, is that right,
Close.
Lauren?
Yes, Eustache Chapuis.
Okay, good enough, thank you. Her second book, Among the Wolves of Court, The Untold Story of Thomas and George Boleyn, is the first scholarly biography of those men, lifting the lid on their rise as highly skilled ambassadors and courtiers who negotiated their way through the complex and ruthless game of politics. And Lauren gives talks regularly around the UK and has been an expert contributor for the Smithsonian series, Henry VIII and the Men Who Made Him, and of course BBC Two's the Boleyns, A Scandalous Family. Dr. Estelle Paranque is an assistant professor of early modern and public history at the New College of the Humanities here in the UK at Northeastern University, and earned a PhD in early modern European history from University College London back in 2016. She's the author of Blood, Fire and Gold, The Story of Elizabeth I and Catherine de' Medici, which will be published by Ebury Publishing in summer of next year. She's participated in award-winning international historical documentaries, including the Secret d'Histoire series on French television, and of course BBC Two's The Boleyns, A Scandalous Family. She appears frequently on radio, BBC Four's Great Lives, and podcasts History Hit. I know Lauren and Estelle personally and professionally. I know them both to be highly passionate and gifted, as well as very strongly grounded historical speakers. I declare an interest as a Tudor historian in what they have to say, particularly in what they have to say about the relationship between the Boleyns and that big bad man that I've been studying my entire professional life, Henry VIII. But enough from me, over to Lauren and Estelle.
Thank you so much, John. Estelle and I are so thrilled to be doing this talk today, and thank you everyone for being here and tuning into our talk, The Boleyns Behind the Scenes of a Scandalous Family. Estelle and I would like to probably quickly say that there were a few raised eyebrows about the title when it first aired, and that's because the title was changed about 2 weeks before the air date. The original title was actually The Boleyns, an Infamous Family. And I think they took inspiration actually from Catherine of Aragon's accusation that Anne Boleyn was the scandal of Christendom. And they felt that perhaps was a bit more fitting. And also I think there's another series coming out quite shortly with the subtitle Infamous. So there you have it, if anyone was curious about that. Before we get into it, Estelle and I are going to be talking not about the family necessarily, but about particular things which we feel made it into the series, but also didn't make it into the series, which we feel are important and really contribute to the Boleyn narrative. And it's going to be ideas of inheritance and foreign and domestic influences, and it all just helps to flesh out the Boleyn story. So I'm quickly to my dear colleague and friend Estelle, I suppose I would ask you first, just before we get into it, what do you think was new about this particular series, and why do you think the Boleyn family was so important to have featured in a series?
Well, thank you so much, Lauren. You're so very kind, and thank you, John. Yeah, we've known you for years now, and it's lovely to still be working with you and still be in touch with you. And thank you for everyone who's here, on your lunch break, maybe eating something nice, I hope for you. But to answer your question, so basically when I was contacted about, participating to the documentary, I thought it was indeed very important to change a bit the narrative. But what I was really interested in is that it was the first time that someone was like, interested in basically in your research, Lauren, in not just Anne Boleyn, but in a family. And I was very much personally interested in showing that Anne Boleyn was more than just, you know, an English rose, for example, that she had great connections. I was linked to her dad and her dad's, you know, own ambitions, but not, again, I think when you say someone is ambitious, we have like kind of like this bad image when actually it's what everyone was trying to do, and everyone was trying during the 16th century and at Henry's court, you know, they were all trying to climb the ladder. So for me, it was a huge opportunity to tell the stories that were not told before, and to tell the, you know, the connections outside of England, and to tell the connections between the Boleyns and, you know, and Europe, continental Europe. And I thought that was a great opportunity for us to do that. And I was very excited as well when they told me that many historians were working on this, because I felt like we could all have our voices and could all work towards this together, creating basically a new narrative. And I think that is what you felt as well, Lauren. Am I right? This is how you
Absolutely. I think what made this series so unique is the fact that the Boleyn story is really the story of so many 16th century families. As you said, this is a society which circles and centers around the king, from which all patronage and favor and opportunity is dispensed. And even though we do use maybe what some people might call buzzwords, ruthless, crazy pole, greedy and ambitious, I think it was important to sort of say ambition is not a dirty word. It is such a human emotion. It is such a driving force. Everyone is ambitious. We are all ambitious. And this wasn't something unique to the Boleyn family. And ambition to rise above your standing and improve generation upon generation is something that I think we can all really relate to. I think it was also really nice to see a series that doesn't focus around Henry VIII. So the narrative isn't driven by the King of England. It's not even driven by his 6 wives, or more realistically, the first 2 wives. It's such a different story. And we do hope that perhaps people, even if you weren't a fan of the Boleyn family and you believe perhaps some of the more negative depictions of them, that perhaps it at least raises some questions and opens the door for dialogue. So if we're good, I'm going to probably just start just giving a little bit of information about the Boleyn family and their background. And we see this in the series as well. Now, it's often said that Anne Boleyn was a nobody and her family were nobodies, and they came from nothing, and they suddenly rose at court because of Anne Boleyn. And this is reflected, I think, in the scholarship throughout the centuries. It really begins in the Victorian period, where there is this sense that Henry VIII had to be rehabilitated, and Anne Boleyn is sort of simplified in a way. She sort of becomes one of 2 narratives. That is that she's either a home-wrecking harlot or that she is a hapless victim. And with both narratives, the villain in that story became her father, Thomas Boleyn. And we see this within the Tudor scholarship from centuries onwards. So modern historians, for example, and I shan't name names, but modern historians, for example, have said that Thomas Boleyn was, he sacrificed his daughters. On his way to an earldom, he slipped 2 daughters into the king's bed, that it was through the sexuality of his daughters that Thomas Boleyn became a great man and was by the same means brought low. Now, this is so inaccurate, and it really doesn't reflect the truth and the nature of the Boleyn family rise. So the Boleyn story really begins several decades before Anne Boleyn is even a thought. And it begins with Thomas Boleyn's grandfather, Geoffrey Boleyn, pictured here. Geoffrey was that pivotal family member. He elevated the family from being a family that worked on the land in Norfolk to actual landowners themselves. So he was involved in the highly lucrative wool trade in Norfolk. And he pioneered for the family this idea of a newly rich mercantile family marrying into a noble and ancient family. And this, of course, brings wealth and prestige and titles. So Geoffrey Boleyn married into the powerful Hu family. He married Anne Hu. These are their brasses from SAL Church, SAL being the little town in Norfolk. It's a 1-pub, 1-horse town minus the pub, and they've lost the horse. It's so small, there's nothing really there. But they were very important, and they were an important part of the fabric and the social fabric of Norfolk. Now, Geoffrey and Anne, they would have, of course, William Boleyn, and William Boleyn did much the same. He married into the powerful and ancient and noble Irish Butler family. Now, we see a little bit of the Butler family come through in the series, perhaps not as much as we would have liked. And I know that quite a few of us filmed about the Butler family. The Butler family connection to the Boleyns and to Thomas cannot be undervalued and understated. The Irish butlers were not only influential and powerful in Ireland, they were major players at the Tudor court as well. So here's our Thomas Boleyn. William married into the Butler family. He married Margaret Butler, and their first son and heir was our Thomas Boleyn. And Thomas Boleyn did exactly as his parents and grandparents had done before him. He married into the powerful and noble Howard family. So we have 3 generations of Boleyns marrying into these families. These threads are coming together. This is what places him at court as someone with connections. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about Thomas Boleyn as a young man. Sorry, I went too far. And I think we can view Thomas Boleyn, and we see a few of these themes in the series. And I think, Estelle, you found this really interesting as well, that we see Thomas Boleyn rising as a young courtier. I like to view Thomas Boleyn within several frameworks, modern frameworks and a contemporary framework. One being Stephen Gunn's, this concept of the new men. We see this in Henry VII and the New Men, which is a wonderful book that Stephen Gunn wrote. And because there was a marked departure in Henry VII's reign from what had come before, so how men and women could rise at court. And this was an age of new men, so men who rose on the back of their own talents, their merits, their skills, their dedication, their intelligence. It complements another study, which is Stephen Greenblatt's concept of self-fashioning, how these men fashioned themselves, how they comported themselves to embody the ideal courtier. So Thomas Boleyn was the kind of man who was able to navigate personal and political circles. He was able to be at home. He was at home in the tilt yard. He was at home jousting, wrestling with the king in the mud for various reasons. He was at home hunting and hawking and dancing and carousing, and yet he was also highly educated. He was able to debate philosophy and religious ideologies and political issues of the day. So our dear friend and colleague Gareth Russell said it quite succinctly. He said, Thomas Boleyn is the jock who can read. And whilst that's a very simple way of looking at it, it actually is true that there is a lot, he embodies all of this idea of the perfect courtier. Now we see in the series the contemporary influence, and that is the work of Baldassare Castiglione's Il Libro del Cortigiano, the Book of the Courtier. And although we know that this book is published in 1528, so it does happen after Thomas Boleyn is already at court, it nevertheless, it talks about the ideals that Thomas Boleyn embodied. So it complements the self-fashioning, it complements the new men idea. It's the handbook. And it was important, and I think Estelle would agree with me, it was important to move away from Thomas Boleyn, the Machiavellian expert, because this idea that somehow he was Machiavellian, this idea that he tapped into the mirror for princes idea, there's nothing to do with that. This was really what the influence was, this Italian thought, this idea of how to get ahead, but how to embody that perfect courtier. So I think that was very important. The court was really a constellation of connections for a man like young Thomas Boleyn. He was very well positioned at court. He was well positioned because he had his grandfather there, as we talked about before, his powerful Butler grandfather, Thomas Butler, for whom he was named. Thomas Butler was one of the titans of the Tudor court. He was Lord Chamberlain to Elizabeth of York during Henry VII's reign, and he was also Lord Chamberlain in the first years of Catherine of Aragon's reign. On the other side, Thomas Boleyn had his father-in-law, Thomas Howard, who had later been reinstated as the second Duke of Norfolk. These men were responsible for his rise at court, and they offered those connections. They enabled him to navigate the various spheres of court, and they likely helped introduce him to the architect of Henry VII's diplomacy, being Richard Fox, the Bishop of Winchester. And Richard Fox's protege was none other than Cardinal Wolsey. So Cardinal Wolsey, of course, would go on to become the architect of Henry VIII's diplomacy as well. It's Wolsey and Fox who would have picked out Thomas Boleyn as the new man in the diplomatic lineup in 1512. So already Thomas Boleyn is rising, he's known, he has a reputation, and he's now going to embark on an incredibly important diplomatic mission, his very first, and he really stands out as a new face in the diplomatic lineup. So we know, of course, that his first embassy is to Margaret of Austria's court in the Netherlands, and his second embassy, much longer embassy, is to France. And of course, here we have a lovely letter written from Thomas Boleyn to Wolsey, which we see in the series, quite a few of these letters where he's basically complaining for about 13 months because things aren't going to plan. But it's just lovely to see Thomas Boleyn and read his words as well. So France is an incredibly important connection. It's an incredibly important part of Thomas's life. And therefore, I'm going to pass this over to the expert.
Well, you're too kind, Lauren. I'm not sure if I'm an expert yet, but I'm definitely very much interested in Anglo-French relations, and I always have been. I mean, I've been working like for 10 years, you know, on various projects about Anglo-French relations. But first, I would just like to comment a bit on what you've discussed, because I think that people really need to understand how new your research is and what you're doing, like by looking at Thomas Boleyn, the way you're looking at him is really changing our perception of the court. You know, when you talk about Castiglione, for example, I taught that a lot to my students, but I know that it's something that still is behind, for example, Machiavelli, which it shouldn't be. And I thought it was so brilliant when this documentary, when we had, you know, our own, as historians and as experts, or whatever you want to call us, honestly, and you know, we had our own ways of showing you what we really liked. And then maybe we'll discuss that, as you know, when you're an academic and a historian, and how you can, you know, influence the narrative that is shared in the public sphere with the public, with you guys, you know, you who are watching and are interested in what we do. And so just by listening, you know, like when you summarized, you know, Thomas Boleyn, you know, kind of, you know, lineage, but also like his importance at court, I think it's so interesting, because you're right, there were no nobodies, they were established. And I think that sometimes it's a mistake we make to make it maybe sometimes a bit more like entertaining or sensational, right? Anne Boleyn comes from nowhere and that's just this big thing. Yes. Yeah, well, it's not true. She doesn't come from nowhere, and but she's going to become this big thing, and that's where, you know, obviously I would like to discuss. And you're right, and everything starts with Thomas, you know, her father, who really wanted to play an important role on the diplomatic scene. And obviously, I'm not going to say it, but I want to say it. You know, France was so important at that time. Though it's very interesting when I say that, because at the same time, we still had the same type of kings. And I'm going to try to explain that with Francis I of France, who was like someone, you know, he was a Renaissance prince. And you have the works of Glenn Richardson, for example, who really like explain this very well. You know, like, so Charles V of Spain, Henry VIII of England, and Francis I of France, and how they're going to compete. Now, what I've been very interested is obviously in looking at the Anglo-French relations, but looking at the influence of the French over the Boleyns, but more particularly, obviously, over those young women. And I've been fascinated with when she's going to be obviously at Francis I's courts, so, you know, 1514 and 1522, and when she's going to, and what's going to happen for her. Well, it's 1521, you know, when things are starting to become a bit complicated for her, but when she's going to be a lady in waiting to Queen Claude, who was the same age, and Queen Claude is the first wife of Francis I. She was 15 or something around that age when she became Queen of France, and she had many, you know, pregnancies. I don't know how she managed, and with many children, and I don't know how she managed either. And you can only, you know, but I do think that the two women because of the young age. They were probably like both 15 and stuff. So I think that they spent some time together, which meant that Anne Boleyn spent some time with Francis I, spent some time with Louise of Savoy, his mother, who's such an important French historical figure, who's going to spend some time with Marguerite of Angoulême, who's going to be Queen of Navarre, and is going to play a massive role in Anne Boleyn's like, I would almost want to say that without this time at the French court, Anne Boleyn would not have become the woman she became, because she would not have had these examples of strong women. She would not have maybe craved for power, because I do believe that, when, as you said, Lauren, like either she's a villain or she's a victim. I believe everyone is more complex than that. Why not? I know I am. But I also believe that, Thomas Boleyn was obviously very ambitious, but I think Anne Boleyn herself was very ambitious. And I think she was extremely influenced by these women from a very young age. And what's very interesting is that the relationship she's going to try to build at a very young age, like she's a teenager, you have to remember that, because you're not the same when you're 15 or 16 and when you're 30, thank God. And so you do learn from mistakes, and you do learn from the way to behave. And I think that Anne Boleyn really learned so much at the French court that she took some valuable lessons from these historical characters that she took then back to England. And obviously I don't think that when she came back she knew what was going to happen, that she had any plan. I don't think she planned everything. I think then it happened for her, and then she started remembering, she started remembering the life lessons that she learned at the French court. And what I've been also absolutely fascinated with is like her own relationship with French ambassadors, because she did try, in a way, and Lauren, you can maybe tell me if you agree or not on this, but I think that because of Catherine of Aragon and her lineage, which is obviously much higher than the Boleyns, she was a princess, she's from Spain, she was daughter of a king and a queen. Anne Boleyn was not, but I think that's why she craved this type of backup, if I can say that, a very strong relationship with the French. And it included, like, as I said, like as you put like on the PowerPoint, like this influence of like Marguerite of Navarre, Marguerite of Angoulême, Queen of Navarre, Louise of Savoy, all these strong women who also, didn't always have the exact right lineage, but still managed to completely thrive and like be so powerful. And I think that here she really saw the French as a sort of family, if that makes sense. Would you agree with me on this?
I think you made a great point in this series as well, as it's an inheritance in a way, because Thomas Boleyn had these relationships with Marguerite of Navarre and Louise of Savoy. We have stories of Louise of Savoy dragging Thomas Boleyn to visit Queen Claude when she's in one of her many confinements, which is not something that would ever happen for a foreign ambassador. But also I loved what you said in the series, that, his daughter is there, Anne is placed there. And so he's able to use his daughter, and not in a bad way, but of course she's one of his informants. She is so useful. And obviously they must have seen each other quite a lot at the French court. Absolutely. But I mean, these women, I think Thomas recognized these women. He recognized the need for these kinds of role models. And I think Anne understood that as well. And, she's very much like her father. We saw that with Margaret of Austria, and we see it with these two women. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think it's so true that, that there is an influence, and there, I think Anne Boleyn was extremely in admiration of these strong women. And it's going to develop even more when she comes back to England, and when she's going to really try to develop this, because she does favor, or she did favor, because they're dead, right? She did favor the French ambassadors. So I think that, it's quite important to remember why she's doing this, and how much she valued the French connection, and how much it's going to help her or not, because that's something else, like that we didn't discuss enough, in the documentary. but obviously the French at some point were like a bit lost with what happened. It's a bit complex, and there are tons of manuscripts about this. So, you know, it's very hard for me also like to just condense that in 5 or 10 minutes. But there is a story there, definitely, between Anne and the French.
I think the problem that Anne ended up having with the French is not necessarily that they were fickle, but there were much larger games going on. It was easy for Catherine of Aragon because she had the familial tie. Charles V was her nephew. There was no getting out of that. So she was always going to have that unwavering loyalty. But it was more difficult for Anne to really always bring France to the table. And I suppose one of the main problems is the fact that Charles V and Francis I were almost always at war. And I think one of the most interesting things, because obviously you and I don't really want to go into Anne's downfall because it's such a crowded field and such a well-traversed narrative, but I think, and I think you would agree, the battle in 1534, there's a naval battle, for example, between Charles V and Francis and their respective allies. You have the Franco-Ottoman alliance, the unholy alliance, as they call it, with Suleiman the Magnificent, and Charles V has his Persian ally, Shah Tahmasp. And it's, of course, it's devastating. France loses. And the ripple effect of this victory that Charles has over France is felt in England, even if it's not necessarily straight away. We know Cromwell can barely speak when he hears about this battle. And I think it was always going to be so difficult for Anne and her family to keep Francis on board, because this is not just keeping a man on board. This is trying to keep an entire empire on your side. And it was always an uphill struggle. And you know, it's really, really frustrating because, of course, we see this whole story laid out before us, but it doesn't end well. And you can see, even as the Boleyns try to perhaps even cultivate an imperial alliance, because France just hasn't come through at the very end. It's quite tragic, actually, to see that play out.
Yeah, and I think I would just like to add something, is that you're totally right, that the problem with France and the support that she was seeking from France France was obviously had a broader political agenda. I mean, all they were discussing was not Anne Boleyn. Can you believe it? Yeah. So you're totally right about that. However, I think what's very interesting is that even if you're right, we don't necessarily want to dive into the downfall of Anne Boleyn. However, it's very interesting how the different French ambassadors, Francis I reacted all very differently to what was happening to her, and some of them did feel a bit powerless, in terms of they didn't really want to let her down, and then at the same time so many things were going on. But also I think they were all a bit shocked. It was one thing to ask for a divorce, because everyone don't believe that the Catholic Church didn't grant divorces. They had no problem with that, but they were not shocked about Henry VIII wanting a divorce and wanting to marry someone else. They were not shocked about that, but they were shocked about the reaction after, the fact that they did it in secret, the fact that they lied about it, and the fact that then there was going to be a break, but the break didn't even happen, clear cut that day, boom, so I think that's why it's so fascinating to look at the relationship between Anne and the French, and what it can tell us. And I can see that there are great questions in the chat, and
I've got to go back to the chat.
I'll let you get on, Lauren.
I think that also the interesting thing is the impact of France on the Boleyn family goes even beyond political as well. I mean, as you talked about Marguerite of Navarre and Louise of Savoy, but the spirituality and the ideas coming out of France had such an impact on Anne, as you know, and it also impacted George Boleyn. And I was so pleased to see this actually be shown in the series as well. George Boleyn and the influence of French thought and the evangelicism, of course, and him actually presenting the dedications to his sister, which we know he did, and these were beautiful French translations of French devotional texts. It was lovely to see, even though poor poor Sam, who played George Boleyn, is standing in what looks like a freezing room, trying to sort of deliver his lines. They filmed in February, and it just looked very grim. But anyway, but so the French impact, I think, on the family cannot be understated, as you said, political and religious, and in terms of the ideas that they had. When it comes to, of course, the influences on the family, we have to sort of separate Thomas and his children, as I think you'd probably agree, Estelle, just because Anne and George were very much a part of this new wave and this new generation of that French evangelical thought. Doesn't mean that Thomas Boleyn was. And we sort of talked about it a little bit in the series, but not all of it made it in. But Thomas Boleyn was actually more aligned with Erasmian humanism. And I think one of the most important, most interesting things about Thomas Boleyn is this relationship that he actually had with the great scholar Desiderius Erasmus. You know, when we talk about Erasmus, we talk about Thomas More's relationship with Erasmus, and oh, how impressive, Thomas More, great friends. He was also friends with Thomas Boleyn, and it's a very understated relationship that the two have. But in particular, I just think, and we didn't get to talk about it in the series, but it's this very, one of the three texts that he actually writes for Thomas Boleyn and dedicates to Thomas Boleyn. And the third being the Preparatio ad mortem, the preparation for death, which actually ties into the Ars Moriendi tradition as well, of how to live one's life in preparation for death. It's so different and so unlike what his children were very influenced by. And it's interesting that Thomas Boleyn actually commissions this in 1533 when his daughter's about to be crowned queen. I think it really speaks to his spirituality, his state of mind. It's a very underappreciated and human element, I think, of Thomas Boleyn as well. It would have been great to see it in episode 3, I think. It's a pity that we didn't make it in, but I did film it, but it didn't make it in. But it would have been nice. But there's just this idea that we have to understand that not everything that George and Anne were passionate about is what Thomas Boleyn was passionate about. So I don't know if you wanted to talk about Anne Boleyn's downfall at all. I know we can just, but I mean, you know, so everyone knows, of course, what happens to Anne and George. It's interesting that we talk about this in episode 3, that Thomas Boleyn sort of starts retiring from court. He goes back to Hever. We didn't really touch much upon the important position that he had at court before he began to retire, and that was Lord Privy Seal, which was a really important part of the government. And that's something that I think perhaps is underappreciated, because we talk about his ennoblements. He's made Earl of Wiltshire, Earl of Ormond. He's also part of this well-oiled government machine. And these are important elements of his life and career, because I think we tend to think of him as just sort of a man who stalks the halls of court, and he's scheming, and he's, you know, reading up on Machiavelli, and he's trying to, you know, work his way up the greasy pole, as we like to always say for some reason. But I just think that this is Thomas Boleyn's garter plate, for example. And it's just interesting because we have at the top, "Now thus," which is actually his great-grandfather's motto. So we've been talking a bit about different types of inheritance, and this again is another type of inheritance. So I thought it would be nice to show. So obviously, we didn't have to see too much of Anne and George's execution in episode 3 of the series, but we did touch on a little bit about what happens to the Boleyn family afterwards, after Anne and George's death. I just wanted to quickly say, because we do see this a lot in TV documentaries and fictional accounts, this idea that Thomas Boleyn was on the jury for either George and the men or Anne. This is blatantly false. And we know this because we have the evidence to support that. We know exactly who was on the jury at all the different trials, and Thomas Boleyn is not listed. There seems to be a confusion to do with the Oyer and Termina, which was opened for the county of Middlesex. And that was to inspect or to investigate crimes committed or something in Middlesex. By the time names are added to that particular Oyer and Termina, by the time charges are brought forward, Thomas Boleyn is no longer there. So that's just a really important point, I think, that needs to be driven home all the time, because I do see this crop up in various documentaries, and it's just very irritating because it's not true. And it just plays into this idea, I think you would agree, Estelle, it plays into this negative portrayal of the family.
Yeah, and I wonder actually if it's not on purpose. You know, I wonder.
Okay.
Don't keep that narrative on purpose, because it
Yes.
does fit into the idea we have of him. And also you add more drama. Can you imagine having the father there? Then it just adds more drama. So I just wonder if, you know, in a way, it's not being done on purpose, as it's repeated and repeated and repeated. It's a bit like Mary Stuart and Elizabeth I always meeting up and stuff. I think, you know, in a way, it's just to add to this more dramatic thing, even if we know it's not true. I don't know. It's just a thought that I had when I was listening to you. So yeah.
I think there's probably something in that, and certainly the way in which we discuss the aftermath of the executions, and there's this narrative that either Thomas Boleyn died a broken man in exile, or he immediately set himself to work his way back up through court again, and neither's really true. And we see some of this in the documentary, which is great, that he retires to Hever, and he only really returns to court when he is obliged to. And we have to remember, he was a peer of the realm, and he didn't really get the luxury, as Owen Emerson says, the luxury of staying at home. He's obliged to go to these court functions. And there's this idea that he remained good friends with Thomas Cromwell, and that's not really the case. And we know that because, for example, this letter that we have here, in 1537, when Cromwell was inducted into the Order of the Garter, he actually asked Thomas Boleyn if he could lend him his Garter badge. So it was clear that Thomas Boleyn wasn't going to go to Windsor for the ceremony, even though he should have. And this letter is the letter that accompanied the Garter badge and sent to Cromwell. And in it, he says twice, "I do this alone for the king's pleasure." So he's making a point. He and Cromwell are not friends. And it's very much the same, I think you'd agree, with his brother-in-law, the Duke of Norfolk, who we all basically said in various ways that we didn't like the Duke of Norfolk in the series. I'm not sure if anyone picked up on our united distaste of the Duke of Norfolk, but certainly they had a fractious relationship as well, and that really does come down to what happened to George and Anne. And I think you would agree, Estelle, it was lovely to see, however, the reconciliation between Thomas and his remaining daughter, Mary Boleyn.
Yes, definitely.
And that was really important. And that was something that I fought to have in the series, because it's never really been shown. And the reason why we know that there was a reconciliation is in part because of these documents that are here on the screen. And this is a draft indenture that I discovered in the Kent archives. And it's English and then it's Latin. It's about 15 pages long. And it's an indenture between Henry VIII and Cromwell, and Mary Boleyn and her husband, William Stafford. And their lawyer is her uncle, James Boleyn, Thomas Boleyn's brother. And this indenture is to transfer properties from the Boleyn portfolio that had obviously they had reverted to the crown after Thomas Boleyn died. And this is just after Thomas's death. So obviously this was already in the planning. So Thomas would have been involved in this before he died. And it's to restore certain properties. In this draft, actually, I think they tried to get Hever back, but it didn't end up happening. So that's interesting. But I think what's really interesting is the tone of this. It's clear that James, her uncle, is obviously doing all he can. And it's clear from the language that Henry is using that he's not happy about this at all. He would rather not have anything to do with any of this. So it's quite terse language at times. But I think it's just a really important element. And again, it's, because the narrative has been so pejorative when it comes to Thomas Boleyn. And here we have this reconciliation. He doesn't want his daughter to be destitute. He wants her to be financially secure and safe. And he wants, of course, the best for his daughter and his grandchildren. And I think that was a really important element of that story.
That was quite moving as well. Like you just showed like the end of
yeah. Well, I mean, and of course I think you and I both love the final scene in episode 3, and of course it features your favorite.
Which is the final scene in your book, isn't it?
This is the final scene in my book. This is in 1578, Elizabeth visits Norwich Cathedral. I actually spent a lot of time in Norwich when I was writing the book, and I talked with the guides, and they talked about how Elizabeth almost bankrupted Norwich, the way Tudors do when they go on progress. They bankrupt towns left, right, and center. And Elizabeth did that, and she held banquets in the cloisters. But it's this mass that she has, and that she does move her throne so that it faces the Boleyn Chantry Chapel, and she's facing actually the tomb of her great-grandfather William Boleyn. And it was such a powerful scene, and I think it was done so beautifully. Yeah. And obviously, because Elizabeth is your favorite queen, so it's lovely to see her as an adult. But it's nice to see the Boleyn inheritance. And I think I said in the series, it's, Elizabeth had always shied away from her mother's lineage. I didn't quite mean shied away. I meant to say that there had always been, as you would agree, had always been a cloud over the validity of Anne's marriage to Henry, and therefore there had always been a cloud over Elizabeth's legitimacy. Yes. And she was still the daughter of a traitor and the niece of a traitor, and that hadn't changed. So it wasn't that she never spoke of her Boleyn relatives. She actually was very close to her Boleyn relatives, but she had to often publicly align herself with the line that made her reign legitimate. And yet here she was in Norwich Cathedral. So it was a very powerful end, and it shows that the Boleyn story doesn't end on the scaffold.
Yes, exactly. But also she did mention her Boleyn's family, in audiences to ambassadors, and I don't think she maybe not in the first 10 years of her reign, but later on, like, she was not like she was very she was showing that she remained very loyal to her roots. And I think that's also very very interesting, and that's why I love that scene. I love that it's in your book, and I loved that it was then on the screen. And I thought it was actually, when they told me they wanted to end on this, I thought it was absolutely perfect to end that series on her and on her lineage to the Boleyns.
Yes, absolutely. And of course here we have Norwich Cathedral and the Boleyn Chapel. And I think it was nice to end also where the story begins as well, in Norfolk. We don't know if Elizabeth visited Blickling or if she sort of took a little tour of the Boleyn heartland, because Norfolk is Boleyn heartland. But it was lovely just to see that full circle. And also, we don't really think about it, but with Elizabeth as well, I mean, she also used the Butler Falcon. So that's not just Anne Boleyn's falcon that we see here. That is Thomas Boleyn's falcon. It's William's, it's Geoffrey's, that's the wrong line. It's Thomas Boleyn and it's the Butler Falcon. So it's Thomas Butler's falcon. And here we have, it says it's Ireland on the screen. As we said, it cannot be underestimated or undervalued. So it's Elizabeth's legacy is as much Boleyn as it is Tudor, and I think we managed to bring that out in the series. And as you said, it was a wonderful note to end the series on.
Yeah.
So I just kind of wanted to ask, because we wanted to talk a little bit about our filming experiences. So Estelle, how did you find the filming? What did you find really interesting in the filming, and what made it such a unique situation this time with this particular series?
Well, I think, to be fair, when you film, I don't know how you felt, Lauren, but I think that there's always a bit of a struggle between everything you want to say, everything you want to share, and what you can actually share and what you can actually say. Let me explain this. We always have our own mind. So but you need to know that sometimes, depending on the producer, it didn't really happen for me with BBC, but in the past it did, where they were trying to make me say something I didn't want to say, or it happened, and then they have a narrative that they want you to dive into, and you're like, well, I'm not the right person to do so. And I think it's important to push back on this, because at the end of the day, you also want to be respected for your own research and your own thoughts and your own arguments. So when you don't know, I think it's okay to say, well, Lauren Mackay is the one who know, or Owen Emerson is the one you should ask, and I've done that quite a few times, or Nandini Das, or Glenn Richardson or Sue Doran, you need to make sure that that you cannot say everything, or you cannot know everything, and that's why we collaborate and everything. But I think that, yeah, people need to remember when they watch a documentary, and I've read that we received, you know, obviously we received some criticism, and we're open about this, but I just want to tell you, they're just doors, they're just gates, they're keys to the books, they're keys to more research. We cannot tell you everything that happened, you know.
Exactly.
Like, it takes so much time to read everything, not in terms of manuscript, but just secondary literature. So please do read it and wait for the next books. They're coming. We're young and passionate and everything. So they're coming your way. So more evidence and research is coming your way. Just stay tuned, you know.
I think you're right, because I mean, people have to understand we were filming for probably 10 hours, maybe more, and our answers were about 4 to 5 minutes long. And out of those 5 minutes, they take a snapshot of what you've been saying, and it's almost like a sound bite to sort of get to keep the narrative going. But I think what made it really special was, apart from everyone else's contributions and just different faces and new narratives, because of course, you know, it wasn't the same series, and I think it was so special not to have it focus on Henry VIII, but to have, for instance, you talking about the French element, which we don't necessarily consider too much in the overall Boleyn story. So I think that was very important. I think it was also really interesting for us as contributors, as well as that we were involved from the ground up. So we were involved in the creation of the storyboards. We were involved in even talking about the costumes, and there were some issues in the costume department because there were several series being filmed at the same time, and it was a bit like, this is what we have. And I know there have been a couple of comments about that. Why is Wolsey's page boy wearing, I don't know, the Welsh line or something? Something crazy things out there. But I think it was also really important that we also showed the Boleyns and told their story in their own words. And that was something that I did with the manuscripts, Thomas Boleyn's ambassadorial dispatches. So actually going line by line with the modern translations, so that Max Dowler, who played Thomas Boleyn brilliantly, could speak those lines. How often do we hear Thomas Boleyn in his own words? How often do we hear George in his own words? We don't. It's as Hilary Mantel always says, change the lens and the viewpoint is new. And I think that really resonated with us as well for this series. It's never been done before. And we do hope that people will go out and read more about the Boleyns. Of course, there's so much more to their story, and much more than we could do justice to in 3 hours.
Yeah, for sure.
Should we answer some questions, perhaps?
Well, perhaps that's a cue for me to dive in first of all. Yes. And you know, just say thank you first of all for just a fantastically articulate and personal and passionate, but also very sort of subtly referenced talk. I can't think of a Society of Antiquaries talk that has had this sort of conversazione format, you know, seeing two people in dialogue and to some extent in debate with each other. And I think it's, as well as bringing out the sheer interest of the story, I think it's a very effective format to see the two of you talking and thinking about this together. Imagine floods of applause from across your viewers in the UK and around the world at this point. You can't hear that, but it's definitely happening.
I'm sure.
But there's, yes, I mean, we've had a lot of questions coming through, and the questions are clustering around certain themes. I'm sure more will now start to come in. But clearly the point that you're making about France and France being key, I mean, that's one of the ways in which you want to change the narrative, isn't it? It's one of the insights in particular that you're bringing. And as you can probably see on your own screens, one of the questions is around that French influence via Anne in England. So it's just, did Anne Boleyn actually introduce French court customs and protocols to the English court once she started to gain influence with Henry VIII? And sort of behind this is a question that might be alarmingly close to a question I asked Estelle in her PhD viva, which is, what does France represent to England at this time? Because it's a whole series of things, isn't it? So if Anne Boleyn is identified as French or pro-French, what does that mean? So, but both of those, if you could, you know, the actual nuts and bolts, court customs, court culture, protocol, maybe dress, maybe forms of a dress, that kind of thing. But then what does France actually represent to the English at this moment?
Well, I do think, and Lauren, you can also obviously jump in. I don't know, because I know you know some.
I bow to your knowledge on this, though, Estelle. Just you go.
Well, I do think we know that she did introduce, like, some French customs, or like she was really interested in French customs and protocols. But I think she also played very carefully because of what France represented at the English court at the time. So we know that basically France and England are like brothers and sisters, like they're siblings. So one day they can really love each other, and I know that, like, they're my two countries now, it's a bit weird, and one day they can really hate each other and be, and I think Henry VIII and Francis I are a very good example of that. And so I think she knew that she had to be careful, especially when she was rising at court, of how much Frenchness she could bring, because though she wanted the support of France, and as Lauren pointed out, they were not her family. So like the allegiance they had to her was in a way very small, and very opportunistic as well. And so she had to, it was a game of them, but she did favor, well, we know that she did favor, French ambassadors, for example. So I think it's very interesting. I would just like to point out, like, because I saw some questions where I would just wanted to say, just a thing about Margaret d'Angoulême and Anne Boleyn. We don't, like, there isn't evidence, and I'm going to explain this. There is no evidence of, like, we don't have conversations, and you have to think about it, because if they were the same place, they're not going to exchange letters. But what's very interesting is, like, how Margaret is going to react later on. And we do have evidence that Anne Boleyn was extremely she played a big part as a lady in waiting to Claude, and she was involved a lot in at the French court. So it's not, it's not far-fetched here to think that some discussions took place. Though it is true, yes, that it is true that Margaret of Navarre refused to sue Anne in 1532. At that time, she thinks that this woman is way too ambitious, and that she's refusing to see her. Anne Boleyn is going to be, heartbroken about this, because she thought they were friends. They were not. So I think that all of this is very important. And just a question of Francis I, it's not really a question of accepted Anne's marriage to King Henry VIII. He's going to support the couple in some ways. He's going to be careful about it, because you're right. He doesn't want his own political agenda to be completely undermined with what is happening with Henry VIII. He doesn't like Henry VIII that much, even if they're like brothers. So he's like, he doesn't really want to get too involved, and that's going to play a huge part here in their relationships. I hope I've answered, like, basically France and England, so much rivalry, sometimes, common interest and common enemies, so that make them allies, basically.
Yeah,
I think that answer sounds pretty convincing to me. Yes. Let's move it on then, the questions, to a different kind of question, which is probably aimed more at Lauren, I think, which is but yeah, to some extent you both, on the question of sort of hindsight, historical hindsight. How do you deal with the risk of what Claire calls perpetual hindsight in the story of the Boleyns, particularly in relation to Thomas Boleyn's education, training of Anne, his focus on her before there was any prospect of her becoming queen? And it's a problem that all biographers face, isn't it? To kind of go back to the story of the one horse, one pub town without the horse in the pub, as you so brilliantly put it, which went straight on Twitter, I have to say.
Oh, no.
But how do you deal with that question of hindsight, both historically and in terms of making a kind of semi-dramatized documentary like this?
That's such an interesting question, and I'm trying to formulate an answer, because yes, of course, the entire narrative of the Boleyn family is stretched out before us. We see where it begins and we see where it ends. And yes, you do have to be careful not to draw these conclusions, and not trying to look for a pattern and not say this happened because that happened at that point. Sometimes it's inevitable, but you have to sort of remove your emotion from it, and you can't look too closely for those kinds of threads. Yeah, it's definitely very, very difficult when you know the story so well, and especially I think with the Boleyn story, when you are sometimes looking for reasons for why certain things happened. I think there's the emotional connection that you have to sort of that comes into play as well, because there's something about the Boleyn story that seems to speak and resonate with so many people, that because of the tragedy of Anne's story. So trying to find that one pivotal moment when things might have been different, if only this had happened, if only that had happened. I mean, it's enough to make any historian crazy, but I think it's just about, in the end, you have to follow the trail of evidence, and sometimes remove yourself to a certain degree, I think, if that makes sense. Estelle, what do you think?
No, I think what you're saying is making sense. I do think that maybe I'm struggling more than you on doing that sometimes. I think you're totally right. I think you have to look at the evidence. I do think that we have to also bear in mind that what is an evidence, that we have different sources. They tell different truths. They tell different stories. That's also why you did your book on the Boleyns. That's also why I did my book on Elizabeth and the French. It's because you want different perspective, and those different perspectives are going to add to the broader story. And so I think that when someone tells you, but what is the evidence? Well, the evidence is, and sometimes the complicated different types of reference or evidence of primary sources, because you cannot just overlook something because you don't have the whole thing, because it tells you a bit of a story. It still tells you something you didn't know. So I think it's like juggling all of this, and I think that's why we love what we do so much, and I think that's why we love writing books so much, because we can do that, and we can delve into the sources. I mean, honestly, I love doing primary research and research in general, and and writing books, because it's just so amazing. And let me tell you guys, there is still more to say, there's still more to write. So if you love the Tudors, please do. You can still have your own voice and find something, because there are manuscripts out there. There are different stories, different angles to take, and we can't do everything with Lauren. So join in.
It's funny, John, of course, was one of my examiners for my PhD on Thomas Boleyn. And John, you said several things that always stuck with me about the PhD, and obviously about, sometimes you do have to make educated guesses, and you do have to say, we can't say for sure this is how it happened, but we can make a reasoned guess that this is plausible. I think I must have said the word plausible about 100 times in my PhD. But something else that you said, which always stuck with me, is that it doesn't matter how much evidence we have, how persuasive the argument, we are never going to convince everybody that this is the story of the Boleyns, and this is the full story, and that this is completely grounded in evidence, and that the evidence is persuasive. And so I think what was important in the series was at times to perhaps draw back away from the obvious argument and present the evidence and say, well, this is it. And you can draw your conclusions from that. And that's also a way in which you distance yourself from, what John sometimes said for me is, don't be too much of an apologist for Thomas Boleyn or for the Boleyns. You have to step back and say, this is the evidence, and you can draw your conclusions from this.
Yeah.
Thank you for reminding me of that. Yes, I mean, I think it's choosing your market, isn't it? And it's so what's appropriate in a PhD thesis and a fully academic monograph may be a different level of appropriate in a book that's a trade book, or that's history that's meant to communicate with the general public. They're related genres, but they're different genres. And the whole question of speculation and the whole question of emotion, which you've raised, is a very interesting one. And we, as professional historians, we don't talk about this very much. We don't talk about the extent to which we should feel, to use Estelle's word, moved by the history that we are reading and studying. Now, working on Francis Walsingham and Catholics being suppressed, and priest holes, and torture and death on the scaffold. I found that pretty moving, genuinely upsetting, and have continued to find that so. But you have to develop strategies of dealing with this in your writing. I mean, the story that you're talking about here is clearly a story that genuinely moves people to this day. And if you look at the chat, then there are lots of people who are saying thank you for bringing particular stories to light. Thank you for rescuing Thomas Boleyn's reputation. People are invested in this particular bit of Tudor history, even more than lots of other bits of Tudor history, which is itself a very interesting process. I mean, I think it's something we don't have time fully to talk about now, but somebody we haven't actually had much of a chance to talk about is Mary Boleyn. And of course, lots of viewers today and viewers of the series will have read The Other Boleyn Girl. They'll be fans of Philippa Gregory, and they will have a particular vision of Mary Boleyn. What do you think we know about that in terms of the presentation of Mary? So is she a reluctant mistress of Henry VIII? Does she have agency of her own? Clearly you have given Anne Boleyn agency. Does Mary have agency as well, do you think? Or is she actually more of a pawn to be moved around by these rather ghastly men, actually, particularly Thomas Howard? But
yes,
I'll take your advice on Thomas. But anyways, on Mary, what do you think?
I think, I mean, I'll go to you in a second, Estelle. I think that Mary did have her own agency to a certain extent, but we have to understand that, and I think we talk about this in the series, that Anne grew up in a very different world from her siblings. So from a very young age, she had to be more or less independent, in the sense that she was on display at a foreign court with adults as more or less a child. So she had to grow up very quickly, and I think she developed that sense of agency and that independence and that way of negotiating, and this sense of self and even self-fashioning. I don't think Mary necessarily had the opportunity, so she didn't necessarily have that background. I actually do think that she didn't really have much say when it came to Henry, only because I don't think anyone really had any say when it came to Henry. I do think, however, that played a part in the breakdown of the relationship between her and her father, because she was married to William Carey, and that was a match that was brokered by the family. They knew the Careys very well. And there's a lot of evidence that Thomas Boleyn nurtured his son-in-law's career as well. So they were clearly close. And then she does this, and we go back and forth with Mary, was her being a mistress of the king beneficial to the family, or did it not really do much for the family in the long run? And I think I tend to opt towards it didn't really do much for the family in the long run. This wasn't France. Mistresses didn't have power the way they did at the French court. They didn't have that sort of agency. So for Mary Boleyn, we have to really wonder, well, what did she get out of it? Not much. What did the family get out of it? Not much. So I know I struggle with Mary Boleyn, because I struggle to get a sense of her in the sources. I don't know, Estelle, how do you feel about Mary?
I think it's funny that you say that, because I would totally agree with you. Like when you said that Anne Boleyn was obviously, her education and the time she spent, with Margaret of Austria and then at the French court, like really shaped her. And I really believe that. I do believe that Mary Boleyn still had some agency with you. I would agree with it. I mean, even if it's to a certain extent. But I would disagree with you when you say what she's done for her family, just because I think Mary Boleyn is the big winner. I mean,
okay.
Yeah, I do
disagree at some point.
Yeah, which is so funny, because look at her lineage to this day.
Oh, okay, yes, I see what you're saying. I was thinking
say that. It's killing me to say that, because then it means that Mary Stuart also like won over Elizabeth, and I'm going to choke on myself right now. But in a way, you do. In a way, I think Mary Boleyn is the big winner of the Boleyns.
That's true. I was thinking jewelry. I'm sorry. I was thinking of the more immediate treasures. But yes,
I would agree with you on that. I just think that if you really look at the bigger picture,
yes,
the one who managed to get,
But that's hindsight. We know that she was the winner.
Exactly. It's that hindsight. Yeah. Hindsight. Yeah. Definitely. Yeah.
Yes.
We've time maybe just for two more questions before wrapping up, and the first is to pick up on the very first thing you were saying about scandal and infamy, and the first line of the series is Anne Boleyn is the most infamous queen in English history or British history.
Yeah.
Now, is that true? And what do we think infamous means? I mean, that's the kind of line that often historical consultants lose control of, isn't it? So that's something that producers absolutely say, no, this is going in. This will sell the series. This will promote it. We are using this whether you like it or not. And you have to step back as an historical consultant, because ultimately those decisions are made by others. But often we're uneasy about those kinds of statements. But would you stick to that? Do you think that Anne Boleyn is the most infamous queen in English or British history?
You know, it's interesting. We didn't have any say. We had no agency, John, when it came to these sorts of things. The buzzwords are buzzwords for a reason. They do draw in an audience, of course. I mean, if I hear the word greasy pole liver again, I think I might just implode. But these are the sort of it's the language that people are used to when it comes to this family, when it comes to the Tudor period, and it's used to draw them in. I don't necessarily think that Anne Boleyn is the most infamous queen. As I said at the beginning, what was done to facilitate her rise as queen was infamous, but I don't think she was infamous herself. I think there are plenty of other queens who were far more infamous than Anne Boleyn, but I think it's just because of that incredible trajectory of her rise, and that incredible fall has, I think, just had such an emotional connection, which I talked about before, and people just think, yes, what an infamous life, what an infamous woman, and what an infamous fate.
Yeah, I think it's really linked to her fate, isn't it? Because it was very shocking. Like even the French, who didn't comment a lot on or much on her execution, apart from Lancelot de Carlet, and we can discuss that source as well, you know. But I think it shows you that, you know, I think it's because of her fate, it's because of what happened, her downfall and everything. But I would agree, like, I think infamous is just sometimes a buzzword, and it does work well. I mean, it does. At the end of the day, you do want people to, you know, to turn on that channel and to watch, because you're hoping that they're still going to have an interest in Tudor history, because Tudor history, that whether you like it or not, and I know some people don't, and they're like, oh, we're tired of it. And I'm like, I understand, I get you. But at the same time, it did shape, you know, the society you live in today. And so that's why there's so much interest in this. And this is also a century of important women, of great women, of power and women. So like, we cannot just, you know, stop talking about this. And I know you believe that everything has been said, and I promise you that's not true. So, you know, I think it's a mix of the two. Yeah. And
we had to call the series something. It couldn't just be the Boleyns, a really interesting dynastic narrative spanning several generations. You know, it had to get people to watch the series. So that's all BBC. That wasn't us.
Okay, good. So here's the final question, and I mean, let's all give thanks that Tudor history is still so buoyant, because it keeps us in employment, and you know, and it's still very buoyant in schools, I think, and it's buoyant in universities. So in order that I can set this, you know, set the recording of this lecture for my students studying the Tudor regime in the second year next year, what does your research, what does your picture of Anne Boleyn tell us about Henry VIII and the kind of monarch, the kind of regime that Henry VIII is and had surrounding him? Maybe just Estelle, 1 minute each.
Estelle, I'll let you go first.
That's a very good question. You know, it's very interesting, because when you look at Anne and France, and Anne and her relationship with the French ambassadors, you don't really look at Henry VIII. Henry VIII really took like a backseat when you do that, and at the same time, is very much present. I know I'm contradicting myself, but please bear with me with what I'm telling you. In a way, he's present and he's not, and I think it's also the story of Henry VIII, of how he played. And you might correct me, John, on this, because you're the expert. But like how he, you know, how he ruled. He was happy for some time for people like to take over. When I say take over, like to make decisions, and he was happy to, but he was always in the background, making sure that they were going where he wanted them to go, or where he wanted, you know, the things to be shaped. And it's the same with France. Like that's, you know, with Francis I, you can see this kind of relationship where, which I think is so funny, because Henry VIII gets so much annoyed with Francis I about the marriage with Anne Boleyn, where it's like, why aren't you supporting me? You know, you donut. He didn't say donut, but he might as well. And, you know, and then and Francis I was like, well, because that's not helping me with what I want. And you almost have this, you could almost have like a modern, you know, you could even picture through letters, through manuscript, a vivid argument between those two men. And when they were seeing each other, for example, like Calais, it's a brilliant moment, because we always talk about the cloth of gold, and we don't really talk so much about Calais in itself. But, you know, it's all about pretending, and it's all about appearing as the bigger man and as the better man, and I have bigger diamonds than you. No, it's me. I have rubies, and I have this, and I'm better dressed than you, and all of this. And I think it's what it shows you. It shows you that Henry VIII actually was very, in my opinion, was very much in charge of what was happening. He was just happy at times to take a back seat, but he was overlooking everything. And it's what you see what happens, you know, with Anne, and it's what happens, you know, with most of his wives as well, and how he treated them. So I think this is how I see him, and it's through the, you know, the sources I've looked at. Lauren, you?
For me, it kind of goes back to Jeffrey Elton's argument in a way, you know, who's actually in control here? Who's actually the boss? Is Henry in control? Is he have the power, or is it those around him? And I think with the Boleyns, you know, we tend to sort of have Anne in charge and manipulating the situation as though Henry's just this man in love, and he's following along. And I think there's more evidence, and there's more evidence grounded in actual scholarship that I've been saying Thomas all night. Henry was very much in control and very much leading the game. And there's something about the way in which he pursued Anne. And it's funny that we sort of romanticize it. And I think in a way, we have to take the romance out of Henry's story when it comes to the Boleyns, because there's nothing that's romantic about it in my view. There's this, it's this chase and the politics even of his courtship of Anne Boleyn and what it does. And I don't know what it says about Henry VIII that he was willing to go to such lengths for this one woman, than to only, you know, tear her apart and tear her entire family apart. But I think it's interesting. It's an interesting insight into personalities and the politics, and as much into Henry's psyche as I'm really willing to go, I think. But certainly there's something about that story and the different perceptions of it, and just where Henry really lies in the story, and the relationships that he even has with the family. I mean, I think we tend to sort of see Henry and the Boleyns rather than Henry and Anne, Henry and Thomas, Henry and George Boleyn, for example. I mean, you know, when Thomas Boleyn dies, Henry VIII pays £65,000 for masses for Thomas Boleyn's soul. What does that say about their relationship? These are sort of elements that we don't tend to think about with the Boleyn narrative and that particular story in relation to Henry VIII as well.
Mm-hmm.
We've worked you very hard. Thank you for such a fantastically illuminating talk. I mean, to conclude, I can do no better than to quote one of the points in the chat from Claire. The sun has just come out here, and this talk was a reflection of that. So thank you for a lovely hour. I love the insights into the latest research.
Oh, that's lovely.
So once again, imagine that wave of applause coming in from across the nation. Thank you so much for this, for these insights into a fascinating series, and a really good double act as well, I have to say. Some very effective baton passing between the two of you, I thought. And just to conclude, an advert for our next lecture in the series, which is by, in fact, one of the senior Tudor historians who appeared in Estelle's and Lauren's series, Professor Susan Doran, who on the 14th of September is speaking on queenship in early modern England, again with that question mark. And thinking about the concept of the monstrous regiment of women and some of the consequences of not one but two women acceding to the English throne from the mid-16th century. And at the Society of Antiquaries, we have a lot of things either owned by them or relating to them, including some manuscripts and portraits. So do come along, do sign up for that on the 14th of September, Queenship in early modern England. So Estelle, Lauren, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.